Chapter 4, The Self. A quote from Kurt Vonnegut. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be. 4.1, The Self. Webster's unabridged dictionary definition of the word self, noun. Definition 1, the identity, character, or essential qualities of any person or thing. Definition 2, the identity, personality, individuality, etc. of a given person, one's own person as distinct from all others. We all believe that human minds contain those special entities we call selves, but no one agrees about what they are. To keep things straight, I shall write self in double quotes when speaking in a general sense about an entire person, and reserve capital S self for talking about that more mysterious sense of personal identity. Here are some of the things people say about the self. Self is the part of mind that's really me, or rather it's the part of me, that is, part of my mind, that actually does the thinking and wanting and deciding and enjoying and suffering. It's the part that's most important to me because it's that which stays the same through all experience. The identity which ties everything together. And whether you can treat it scientifically or not, I know it's there because it's me. Perhaps it's the sort of thing that science can't explain. This isn't much of a definition, but I don't think it is a good idea to try and find a better one. It often does more harm than good to force definitions on things we don't understand. Besides, only in logic and mathematics do definitions ever capture concepts perfectly. The things we deal with in practical life are usually too complicated to be represented by neat, compact expressions, especially when it comes to understanding minds. We still know so little that we can't be sure our ideas about psychology are even aimed in the right directions. In any case, one must not mistake defining things for knowing what they are. You can know what a tiger is without defining it. You may define a tiger, yet know scarcely anything about it. Even if our old ideas about the mind are wrong, we can learn a lot by trying to understand why we believe them. Instead of asking, what are selves, we can ask instead, what are our ideas about selves? And then we can ask, what psychological functions do those ideas serve? When we do this, it shows us that we do not have one such idea, but many. Our ideas about ourselves include beliefs about what we are. These include beliefs both about what we are capable of doing and about what we may be disposed to do. We exploit these beliefs whenever we solve problems or make plans. I'll refer to them rather vaguely as beliefs whenever we solve problems. I'll refer to them rather vaguely as a person's self-images. In addition to our self-images, our ideas about ourselves also include ideas about what we'd like to be and ideas about what we ought to be. These, which I'll call a person's self-ideals, influence each person's growth from infancy, but we can usually find them hard to express because they're inaccessible to consciousness. 4.2. One self or many. One common image of the self suggests that every mind contains some sort of voyeur puppeteer inside, to feel and want and choose for us the things we feel, want and choose. But if we had those kinds of selves, what would be the use of having minds? And on the other hand, if minds could do such things themselves, why have selves? In this concept of a self Is this concept of a self of any real use at all? It is indeed, provided that we think of it not as a centralized and all-powerful entity, but as a society of ideas that include both our images of what the mind is and our ideals about what it ought to be. Besides, we're often of two minds about ourselves. Sometimes we regard ourselves as a single coherent self-coherent entities. Other times we feel decentralized or dispersed, as though we were made of many different parts with different tendencies. Contrast these views. Single self view, I think I want, I feel. It's me, myself, who thinks my thoughts. It's not some nameless crowd or cloud of selfless parts. Multiple self-view. One part of me wants this, another part wants that. I must get better control of myself. We're never wholly satisfied with either view. We all sense feelings of disunity, conflictive motives, compulsions, internal tensions, and dissensions. We carry on negotiations in our head. We hear scary tales in which some person's mind becomes enslaved by compulsions and commands that seem to come from somewhere else. And the times we feel most reasonably unified can be just the times that others see us as the most confused. But if there is no single central ruling self inside the mind, what makes us feel so sure that one exists? What gives that myth its force and strength? A paradox, perhaps. It's because there are no persons in our heads to make us do the things we want, nor even ones to make us want to want. That we construct the myth that we're inside ourselves. 4.3. The Soul. A quote from T.S. Eliot, and we thank thee that darkness reminds us of light. A common concept of the soul is that the essence of a self lies in some spark of invisible light, a thing that cowers out of body, out of mind, and out of sight. But what might such a symbol mean? It carries a sense of anti-self-respect, that there is no significance in anyone's accomplishments. People ask if machines can have souls, and I ask back whether souls can learn. It does not seem a fair exchange. If souls can live for endless time and yet not use that time to learn, to trade all change for changelessness, and that's exactly what we get with inborn souls that cannot grow, a destiny the same as death, an ending in permanence incapable of any change and hence devoid of intellect. Why try to frame the value of a self in such a singularly frozen form? The art of a great painting is not in any one idea, nor in a multitude of separate tricks for placing all those pigment spots, but in the great network of relationships among its parts. Similarly, the agents, raw, that make our minds are by themselves as valueless as aimless, scattered daubs of paint. What counts is that what we make of them. We all know how an ugly husk can hide an unexpected gift, like a treasure buried in the dust or a graceless oyster bearing a pearl. But minds are just the opposite. We start as little embryos, which then build great and wondrous selves, whose merit lies entirely within their own coherency. The value of a human self lies not in some small precious core, but in its vast constructed crust. What are those old and fierce beliefs in spirits, souls, and essences? They're all insinuations that we're helpless to improve ourselves. To look for our virtue in such thoughts seems just as wrongly aimed a search as seeking art in canvas cloths by scraping off the painter's works. 4.4. The conservative self. How do we control our minds? Ideally, we first choose what we want to do, then make ourselves do it. But that's harder than it sounds. We spend our lives in search of schemes for self-control. We celebrate when we succeed, and when we fail, we're angry with ourselves for not behaving as we wanted to. And then we try to scold or shame or bribe ourselves to change our ways. But wait, how could a self be angry with itself? Who would be mad at whom? Consider an example from everyday life. I was trying to concentrate on a certain problem but was getting bored and sleepy. Then I imagined that one of my competitors, Professor Challenger, was about to solve the same problem. An angry wish to frustrate Challenger then kept me working on the problem for a while. The strange thing was, this problem was not of the sort that even interested Challenger. What makes us use such roundabout techniques to influence ourselves? Why be so indirect, inventing misrepresentations, fantasies, and outright lies? Why can't we simply tell ourselves to do the things we want to do? To understand how something works, one has to know its purposes. Once, no one understood the heart, but as soon as it was seen that the heart moves blood, a lot of other things made sense. Those things that look like pipes and valves were really pipes and valves indeed, and anxious, pounding, pulsing hearts were recognized as simple pumps. New speculations could then be formed. Was this to give our tissues drink or food? Was it to keep our bodies warm or cool? For sending messages from place to place? In fact, all those hypotheses were correct, and when that surge of functional ideas led to the guess that blood can carry air as well, more puzzle parts fell into place. To understand what we call the self, we first must see what selves are for. One function of the self is to keep us from changing too rapidly. Each person must make some long-range plans in order to balance single-purposeness against attempts to do everything at once. But it is not enough simply to instruct an agency to start to carry out our plans. We also have to find some ways to constrain the changes we might later make, to prevent ourselves from turning those plan agents off again. If we changed our minds too recklessly, we could never know what we might want next. We'd never get much done because we could never depend on ourselves. Those ordinary views are wrong that hold that selves are magic, self-indulgent luxuries that enable our minds to break the bonds of natural cause and law. Instead, those selves are practical necessities. The myths that say that selves embody special kinds of liberty are merely masquerades. Part of their function is to hide from us the nature of our self-ideals, the chains we forge to keep ourselves from wrecking all the plans we make. 4.5. Exploitation. Let's look more closely at that episode of Professor Challenger. Apparently, what happened was that my agency for work exploited anger to stop sleep. But why should work use such a devious trick? To see why we have to be so indirect, consider some alternatives. If work could simply turn off sleep, we'd quickly wear our bodies out. If work could simply switch anger on, we'd be fighting all the time. Directness is too dangerous. We'd die. Extinction would be swift indeed for species that could simply switch off hunger or pain. Instead, there must be checks and balances. We'd never get through one full day if any agency could seize and hold control over the rest. This must be why our agencies, in order to exploit each other's skills, have to discover such roundabout pathways. All direct connections must have been removed in the course of our evolution. This must be one reason why we use fantasies to provide the missing paths. You may not be able to make yourself angry simply by deciding to be angry, but you can still imagine objects or situations that make you angry. In the situation about Professor Challenger, my agency work exploited a particular memory to arouse my anger's tendency to counter sleep. This is typical of the tricks we use for self-control. Most of our self-control methods proceed unconsciously, but we sometimes resort to conscious schemes in which we offer rewards to ourselves. If I can get this done, I'll have more time for other things. However, it is not such a simple thing to be able to bribe yourself. To do it successfully, you have to discover which mental incentives will actually work on yourself. This means that you, or rather your agencies, have to learn something about one another's dispositions. In this respect, the schemes we use to influence ourselves don't seem to differ much from those we use to exploit other people, and similarly, they often fail. When we try to induce ourselves to work by offering ourselves rewards, we don't always keep our bargains. We then proceed to praise the price or even to deceive ourselves, much as one person may try to conceal an unattractive aspect of a bargain from another person. Human self-control is no simple skill, but an ever-growing world of expertise that reaches into everything we do. Why is it that, in the end, so few of our self-incentive tricks work well? Because, as we have seen, directness is too dangerous. If self-control were easy to obtain, we'd end up accomplishing nothing at all. 4.6. Self-control. Those who really seek the path of enlightenment dictate terms to their mind. Then they proceed with strong determination. A quote from Buddha. The episode of Professor Challenger showed just one way we control ourselves, by exploiting an emotional aversion in order to accomplish an intellectual purpose. Consider all the other kinds of tricks we use to try and force ourselves to work when we're tired or distracted. Willpower. Tell yourself, don't give in to that, or keep on trying. Such self-injunctions can work at first, but finally they always fail, as though some engine in the mind runs out of fuel. Another style of self-control involves more physical activity. Move around, exercise, inhale, shout. Certain physical acts are peculiarly effective, especially the facial expressions involved in social communication. They affect the sender as much as the recipient. Expression: set jaw, stiffen upper lip, furrow brow. Another kind of stimulating act is moving to a stimulating place. We often perform actions that directly change the brain's chemical environment. Chemistry: take coffee, amphetamines, or other brain-affecting drugs. Then there are actions in the mind with which we set up thoughts and fantasies that move our own emotions, arousing hopes and fears through self-directed offers, bribes, and even threats. Emotion: if I win, there's much to gain, but more to lose if I fail. Perhaps most powerful of all are those actions that promise gain or loss of the regard of certain special persons. Attachment: imagine admiration if you succeed or disapproval if you fail, especially from those to whom you are attached. So many schemes for self-control. How do we choose which ones to use? There isn't any easy way. Self-discipline takes years to learn. It grows inside us, stage by stage. 4.7. Long-range plans. In the search for truth, there are certain questions that are not important. Of what material is the universe constructed? Is the universe eternal? Are there limits or not to the universe? What is the ideal form of organization for human society? If a man were to postpone his search and practice for enlightenment until such questions were solved, he would die before he found the truth. He found the path, a quote from Buddha. We often become involved in projects that we can't complete. It is easy to solve small problems because we can treat them as though they were detached from all our other goals. But it is different for projects that span larger portions of our lives, like learning a trade, raising a child, or writing a book. We cannot simply decide or choose to accomplish an enterprise that makes a large demand for time, because it will inevitably conflict with other interests and ambitions. Then we'll be forced to ask questions like these. What must I give up for this? What will I learn from it? Will it bring power and influence? Will I remain interested in it? Will other people help me with it? Will they still like me? Perhaps the most difficult question of all is, how will adopting this goal change me? Just wanting to own a large, expensive house, for instance, can lead to elaborate thoughts like these. That means I'd have to save for years and not get other things I'd like. I doubt that I could bear it. True, I could reform myself and try to be more thrifty and deliberate, but that's just not the sort of person I am. Until such doubts are set aside, all the plans we make will be subject to the danger that we may change our mind. So how can any long-range plans succeed? The easiest path to self-control is doing only what one is already disposed to do. Many of the schemes we use for self-control are the same as those we learn for influencing other people. We make ourselves behave by exploiting our own fears and desires, offering ourselves rewards or threatening the loss of what we love. But when short-range tricks won't keep us to our projects for long enough, we may need some way to make changes that won't let us change ourselves back again. I suspect that in order to commit ourselves to our largest, most ambitious plans, we learn to exploit agencies that operate on larger spans of time. Which are our slowest changing agencies of all? Later, we'll see that these must include the silent, hidden agencies that shape what we call character. These are the systems that are concerned not merely with the things we want, but with what we want ourselves to be. That is, the ideals we set for ourselves. 4.8. Ideals. We usually reserve the word ideals to refer to how we think we ought to conduct our ethical affairs. But I'll use the term in a broader sense to include the standards we maintain, consciously or otherwise, for how we ought to think about ordinary matters. We're always involved with goals of varying spans and scales. What happens when a transient inclination clashes with a long-term self-ideal? What happens, for that matter, when our ideals disagree amongst themselves, as when there is an inconsistency between finding the things we want to do and those we feel we ought to do? These disparities give rise to feelings of discomfort, guilt, and shame. To lessen such disturbances, we must either change the things we do or change the ways we feel. Which should we try to modify? Our immediate wants or our ideals? Such conflicts must be settled by the multi-layered agencies that are formed in the early years of the growth of our personalities. In childhood, our agencies acquire various types of goals. Then we grow in overlapping waves in which our older agencies affect the making of the new. This way, the older agencies can influence how our later ones will behave. Outside the individual, similar processes go on in every human community. We find children taking after persons other than themselves by absorbing values from their parents, families, and peers, even from the heroes and villains of mythology. Without enduring self-ideals, our lives would lack coherence. As individuals, we'd never be able to trust ourselves to carry out our personal goal plans. In a social group, no one person would be able to trust the others. A working society must evolve mechanisms that stabilize ideals, and many of the social principles that each of us regard as personal are really long-term memories in which our culture stores what they have learned across the centuries.